Good evening. My name is Tammy O'Callahan. I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes tonight on the broad topic of the First Amendment with an eye to how it has been viewed over the years and how that view has evolved. Um, as a historian, it's important that we look at things as objectively as possible. It is also important when we're teaching, in a position to teach something, that we take time to understand the basis for the ideas on which they were founded. The First Amendment is basically an amendment guaranteeing freedom of expression in a variety of ways. I'm going to talk just briefly about the freedom of speech and of the press. A free press was not particularly encouraged in the colonies by England. Great Britain was distrustful of colonial free speech and free press because they were afraid of what it might do to their position in authority over the colonies, and indeed it had that effect. This did not stop colonials from printing and distributing widely pamphlets and newspapers and things that did indeed encourage rebellion as the Revolutionary War approached. The early national government wasn't too fond of free press later on when it was directed against them. The Sedition Act, passed in 1798, made it illegal for people to speak negatively of the government. That, of course, was overturned. Those who were instrumental in the language of the Bill of Rights valued those basic rights, including freedom of various kinds of expression, based on the foundational idea of natural rights, those inalienable rights which man should not rightly interfere with. They were influenced by men like Locke and Cato. In fact, Cato, who was widely published around the pre-revolutionary era, believed that, quote, freedom of speech is the great bulwark of liberty. They prosper and die together, and it is the terror of traitors and oppressors and a barrier against them, end quote. This phrasing was nearly quoted in Article 12 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Men spoke of the freedom of speech and press as indispensable partners of liberty in governing. As time went on, some great legal minds wanted something else upon which to base their view of freedom. Men like Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes began taking a more practical approach to the rights of man, thinking instead of them as an interest that had to be balanced with the good of society as a whole. Once the judiciary threw out the idea of natural rights as a basis for freedoms, they replaced the limited concept of rights with the limitless, nearly limitless concept of interest. This removed the more objective standard by which violations and limitations could be judged and looked instead at individual interest versus social interest in order to make judgments based on subjective reasoning. In time, it came down to individual interest versus state interest. As scholar Stephen Heyman put it, these men saw the function of law was not, this is a quote, the function of law was not to protect fundamental rights, but rather to promote social welfare as defined by the community or state, end quote. There have been several important cases in the United States over the history of the nation concerning this amendment. Some have involved pornographers, advertisers, and others news publishers, broadcasters. Justice Harlan Stone expressed his view in the 1938 case of U.S. versus Caroline Products Company that he felt that the First Amendment cases involving free speech needed to be handled with a special level of care because he felt that that right in particular was an important tool in our society for giving the people a voice over bad legislation. One of the earliest cases involving this amendment and how it would be interpreted was Schenck versus U.S., in which Justice Holmes used the clear and present danger qualification to set the standard for judging a free speech issue. The matter of free speech and freedom of the press are getting more and more complicated in our modern society as the way we communicate evolves into so many different arenas for publication and information. News outlets now have to compete with more online sources for audiences. And the younger generation is much more likely to get their information from a social media source or a YouTube video than they are from a newspaper or a television news program. As this happens, the temptation to present information in a more and more salacious way and to beat out rivals with edgy presentation is an ever-present danger in itself. A really good guideline for Christians in a world of self-publishers on social media is found in 1 Peter 2:16 and Philippians 4:8. Let's not use our liberty as a cloak for vice, and let's run what we say and publish through the filter of whether it's true, lovely, noble, edifying, and virtuous. Thank you. Have a good evening.